So you may have heard the phrase, we talk about a Christian Sabbath. Sometimes there's people who will talk about, I can't stand stuff in my pocket, sorry. You talk about the Christian Sabbath, and it has a mixed metaphor in a way. To me, it's a little misleading. I understand it, but sometimes I don't get how some people have applied it. So that's what we want to talk about this morning is the idea of the Sabbath. And that I want to be able to, when we finish this lesson, a couple of objectives is one, understand what the Sabbath was. And what does it mean for you and I today? Because that's what's really very important to know. And as we go through this, I hope you'll see the beauty of what the word means and how God uses it as we go through this. Because we'll find people who are trying to bind that idea that, there's a Christian Sabbath. The Seventh-day Adventists, they worship on Saturday. And they say that that's God's day, the Sabbath, that we must recognize. And they go to the Old Testament, and they say that's where it says. And we'll see scriptures where that's what the Old Testament says. Then we have people that kind of like, well, they don't really necessarily understand. And they'll say, well, the Christian Sabbath is when? Today. They'll say, today, Sunday, is the Christian Sabbath. They're both wrong. Does that surprise you? This is not the Christian Sabbath. And so that's what I want to be able to show you is what is the Christian Sabbath as we go through this. So where do we run into this idea, this word? Because what the word itself simply means is to cease. That's the Hebrew word. And it means to rest, stop. That's it. And so where do we find that word the first time? If you'll recall, we go back to the creation. And in the beginning, as God created each day, he said he declares it beautiful. And then the next day he creates and he says it's beautiful. And then he goes through 6 days. He creates everything. And he says it's beautiful. Everything is created. There's nothing else to create. Nothing new. All the molecules and the black holes and the galaxies and all the nebulas and everything out there. It is done. And so it says he rested. And that's where when we look in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 and 3. And it says, and on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested. Sabbath. Sabbath. If you go and look at the Hebrew, it's Sabbath. So I want to tie those together, okay? Keep that in your mind. He rested. Some translations even say ceased, which is appropriate, isn't it? I mean, again, like I said, if you look at the Hebrew dictionary, both those are what it says. But this is where you have to say, well, what's it in the context of? It's like, Ron was driving really fast and then he sabbat. He stopped. Would that work? Yes, in Hebrew it would work. But you'd go, come on, he didn't rest. That's not what we're talking about. So that's like a lot of these Hebrew words. We really have to make sure we understand the context and what it says. So did he stop working? Yes. What's the purpose? Look on. On the seventh day, he rested from the work that he had done. So we know it's rest, not just also stop. We already said he stopped, finished. The seventh day, he made it holy because God rested on that day. He sabbat on that day, his work that he had done in creation. So he not only finished and said everything and declared it great and perfect, he took the next time the sun came up on the seventh day of the first seventh day of any existence of any material things in the world, the very seventh day. Think about that. We've had a lot of seventh days, haven't we? We've had a lot of sunrise, sunset, sunrise, sunset, sunrise, sunset, sunrise, sunset. So go back and think for a moment. Every time the sun came up, after he created light and he got all that going, something came up, he created. That night stopped. Next day comes. But on that seventh day, the first seventh day, God truly rested. Now, did he sleep in? Did he rejuvenate his muscles because he's still a little sore from all that creation? Well, no. We know it's not that. There's something he's already starting to foreshadow. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that idea of foreshadowing. I bring that up a lot. It's very important because if we're going to then again try to apply that we have a Christian Sabbath and take the old law and apply it today, we really have to understand this concept of when God is foreshadowing, what that means. Foreshadowing biblically, theologically means that you're taking something and you're looking at the shadow. So God in the Old Testament, things were a shadow. Oh, what's a shadow? Well, if you walked out right now and you looked at your car and you didn't look at the car, you looked down, you'd see the shape of what? A shadow of your car. Is it your car? Can you drive your shadow home? No. What do you want? The shadow or you want the car? You want the car, right? The Old Testament was a shadow. That's exactly what the Hebrew writer says. So I'm not creating this. This is exactly what he teaches. He says, all those things were just a shadow. So where do we see these shadows? See, that's where when you get in the Old Testament, that's the beauty of it. You'll be reading along, and I'll be reading along, and all of a sudden, whoa, that's a shadow. You know how do I know? Because I know what the real thing looks like now. For example, if I'd never seen a shadow before, but I knew what my car was, and then one day all of a sudden this little dark, little fuzzy thing kind of looked I'd go, that's a shadow of my car. We are going backwards, in other words. We can look now with the real thing, with clarity, and then go and see the beautiful shadowing. Because that's what God was doing. God was bringing forth his plan from creation. A part of it, if you recall, from the beginning of the foundations, God knew and understood that we were going to make a bad choice and we were going to sin, right? And so it even says from that point, when God was bringing the world together on those days, he had already made a plan that his son would come and his son would die on the cross in order to bring us back into fellowship that was fixing to be broken right after he created us. He knew that was going to be broke. So he starts putting shadows down the trail and pointing to the real thing, which was going to be his son. And so I hope that will be that little jewel that as you start to read stuff in the Old Testament, you'll go, oh, I know what that is. Melchizedek is a great shadow, isn't he? You look at Melchizedek and you go, whoa, he's a priest of the Most High God, but yet he's not Jewish. And all of a sudden you go to the Hebrew writer and he goes, that is the real thing with Jesus Christ. Melchizedek was a shadow of the priesthood that would come. So anyway, I killed that enough, I hope. But it's important because we start to see, honestly, the first shadow of something that was to be. And that was the Sabbath. You know, it's interesting because from the time of creation to the time when Moses comes along, there is no mention of Sabbath. There's no command. There's no talk about it. There's nothing. There's not even anything talked to with Cain and Abel about the Sabbath. But we know there was something about sacrifice, right? Why not the Sabbath? I don't know. But there's no command, no directives, any scripture indicating that God told anybody up until Moses that they should have a Sabbath, a day of rest. And it's interesting on the first time when he brings this out. So that meant, if you think about it, that meant that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and all of them that grew up in Egypt and became slaves, and Moses himself, you know, they didn't have the book of Genesis. They didn't have the Bible. That would be inspired and written later. But up to that point, they didn't understand what Sabbath meant. They didn't have that. It wasn't a command. We think it was because they were Jews, right? We think, oh yeah, well, in Israel, when they were slaves, they had to celebrate the Sabbath. No, they didn't. It wasn't until they left. And it wasn't until they're grumbling. They're grumbling out there right after they get through the water. The waves aren't even settled down from the sloshing around after the flood, after he divides the water. And they're already going, oh man, you brought us out here to die. We're starving to death. And so God said, okay. He brings them manna. And then in that instructions, that very interesting, again, like I said, they don't grasp yet or understand what that Sabbath means. And he says, now, you're going to go out each day and you're going to collect a portion for that day only. If you try to keep it overnight, it's going to spoil. Now, what's that a shadow of within itself? I will provide for you every day, each day, every day. Don't be doubtful. And the way he prevented that is when somebody would hoard a little bit extra, by morning it was spoiled. Well, I better gather extra because, I might need a midnight snack, or I might need, I don't know what he's going to show up tomorrow, or maybe I won't be able to get enough manna, so let's store a little. And so, no. But then all of a sudden, on day 6, he says this. He said, what the Lord commanded, tomorrow is the day of solemn rest, a holy day to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside and keep it till morning. And then he says, jumping from there, we see the command, but what he's saying to them is, this is the first time they've seen this, God saying to them, there's a day you got to set apart. And what do you do on that day? He doesn't tell them. He doesn't say anything. Even under Mosaic law, it just says, keep the Sabbath holy, set apart. It's not a routine work week. It's not a routine day. That's all holy means. Doesn't mean it's all special and high glow and stuff, something really weird about it. No, it just means it's not normally, it's a separate day from the others. That's all holy means, set apart. You take that one day and you don't work. That's all it said, even in the 10 Commandments. That's all it said. So when finally, so they don't even have the Mosaic law yet, by the way, just to help you there. They had just left Egypt. They're not at Mount Sinai. They have not received the law. And God's already telling them stuff, isn't he? He's already telling them. You know what he's doing? He's taking a slave group of people and building them into a nation. He's taking a lot of lost people and he's bringing them in. Oh, that's a shadow, isn't it? Us, lost in sin, taking us out, bringing us. So they're already starting to get that idea of the importance of that one day. Now, circumcision was a covenant sign. They still had to do that. Did you know they hadn't? They'd stopped doing that. That's how irreligious they were. They probably knew Jehovah about as good as you do. They'd lived 400 years in slavery. And so they're starting to see this. But that's what I find interesting. He didn't get them on the other side of the Red Sea and go, okay, guys, thou shalt not kill. Quit coveting your neighbors. Leave that guy's goat alone and start just barking out, commandments. The first direction from God is about taking a day and resting. It's not moral. There's nothing it's not a moral behavioral situation, is it? It's not blaspheming God. It's just so interesting. It's right there, And then we come over to the law when it's given. And he said, and the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this sign is between me and throughout your generations, that you may know that, what? Okay, so pause right there, because I got a little bit more to read. But look at what he says. Take the day, same thing he said whenever they received the manna. But now, he says what? He says, it's a sign. What does that sound like if you were to jump back to a particular guy named Abraham? Circumcision, doesn't it? That circumcision was a sign of something between Abraham. This is now, and again, like I said, never had been a sign before. Now it's unique with his people. Now, this is going to make a little more sense when we jump into Hebrews, and we'll see. That's why I'm slowing down so we can appreciate what he's saying here. Between me and all your generations. This is between me and your descendants. Genealogical. There's a promise that's to go out to all nations, but let's keep it. What he's talking about is this, literally their genealogical descendants is a sign between them. Important point. And what? That I am the Lord. So what's the day for? I am the Lord. So now we have, don't work, and when you don't work, guess what you're thinking about? I am the Lord. And what do? You know what you do? You start reflecting about this God. You start remembering all the things that he did for your people to bring them out. And if you go back even further, you go back to a time in a relationship where Adam and Eve had with God, where they were honestly in a Sabbath, an eternal Sabbath. Now, I'm kind of applying that a little bit, but think about it for a moment. They were genealogically perfect. Their genetic code was perfect when they were created by God. Einstein would look like an imbecile. Seriously. Their IQ, you probably couldn't measure it, Adam and Eve. They were going to live forever, as long as they had access to the tree of life. So that meant no decay. You see, from the time we're born, honestly, once we reach adulthood, we're in a spiral downhill. We start falling apart. You know what starts falling apart? Our genes, the little ends of our genetic code, the little twisty X thing, they start unspiraling. Did you know that? They start coming apart. Our DNA starts coming apart. And you know what that causes? It causes headaches, cancer, all sorts of problems that we're suffering that cause us to be in misery. And you know what it started from? Sin. Sin. If we would have never sinned, we wouldn't be sitting here while our genes are falling apart. Because we would have been in the perfect, non-mutated genetic pool of Adam and Eve. You see, the genetic degradation also occurred after the world was flooded, and all of a sudden, all that UV light, and God separated the clouds, and guess what? You get sunburn, you get all these genetic defects, and now we have no access. You see the miserableness of it? And that's why it bothers me when people go, well, why does God let babies die of cancer? And why does God? God didn't do that. Adam and Eve started that, and now we're living a consequence. Just like women with labor pain. We're living a consequence. So evil and these things occur because what? We are not restful. We are not in a restful state. We lost that Sabbath rest out of creation. You know what? Another thing that just dawned on me while I was sitting here and thinking about it. I don't even know if they slept. We just assumed that Adam and Eve probably slept at night, right? I mean, sun went down, they probably slept. Why? They'd have no need for rest. If you really think about the need for rest and you look at the science, the knowledge of rest, it is imperative that a person receives a minimum amount of sleep, and none of us get it. The older I get, the more I'm struggling to get a good night's rest. But weight loss, weight gain, your health is severely impacted by the quality and quantity of sleep. A person will lose their minds, literally, go insane if they do not sleep over a certain period of time. They will literally break down mentally. That's a part of torture. You know, I listened to the Miami football coach, and I was watching something, and he's sitting there telling, we got a game, and he goes, you know what, guys, you know what? And he stopped. This is amazing. He stopped, and he looked at him, and he goes, you know what the most important thing is this week? Sleep. I want you guys to make sure this week you sleep good every night. And I thought, wow, you'd think a coach would be saying, you know, I want you guys to be on your A game. I want you to... See, I mean, it's that important. You know it, I know it. You see the shadowing we're getting here? We're already starting to see some things because God knew what sin was going to throw us into that state. And so whenever they took the Sabbath, God said, pause from your work. And by the way, why are you working? Why are you sweating? And Why are you pulling weeds out? Why are you doing that? Well, that's right. We sinned. And you told man that from now on, guess what? You're going to be pulling weeds. You're going to work hard. You're going to, with the sweat of your brow. And so when we stop and we're in that Sabbath day, they should reflect on that. It was a beautiful day, a day that we should take. Now you're sitting there going, Ron, that sounds like a Christian Sabbath is Sunday because that's what we're doing. Okay, I'll give you that, but it's not, okay? Hang in there. We're going to get to that. But of course, so going on, in verse 17, he said, it is a sign between me and you and the people of Israel. In 6 days, what does he say? I made the heaven and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested. He takes them back to creation. And what does that do when, just like I did? What did I do? I took you where? I took you to creation and showed you what a wonderful rest that you had. And it's gone. And you know what you have to do if you're being honest with yourself? I did that. I'm responsible for not being able to have this day every day. All my life. I've suffered because of that choice. But come along in time, we see that it bless their hearts, the good old Pharisees. So the people go off into rebellion. They end up going off into slavery. They come back, the tribe of Judah. They rebuild Jerusalem, yada, yada, yada. They don't want to repeat that pattern. They don't want to have the people fall away from the law, so they want to make sure that we're understanding what Mosaic law is. So you have these groups that are very invested in making sure we don't go to captivity, that they start interpreting the law to make sure you understand it. Every aspect of it. Well, guess what? They had 39 different categories of labor that you could not do. They were all based around harvesting and making of food and then making of clothes. And from there, there was over 600 little things that went on under each of the 39 different categories. The Mishnah has them listed out. You can go and Google them and look them up. Now, one rabbi I read this last couple of weeks was saying he took one of those, just one of them, and it took him 1.5 years to study it and looked at it, and he was just like, what? See, the Pharisees were like, we're not missing nothing. We're going to make sure that we don't go back and get our temple destroyed and go into captivity. So what do? They go ultra the other way. And they ripped out the very essence of what God had wanted for them. And that was rest. Reflection upon the beautiful creation, reflection upon their relationship with Him, and that through this relationship that they should have rest. If you go back to the old law, one of the things God had promised them, not only would they have this day of rest, but if they would just follow Him and obey Him. He said, you will never have any disease, any pestilence. You're not going to have enemies that are going to flood into your border. Your young people will grow up. You'll have a strong economy. You're going to be invincible. What does that sound like? Very close to the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? Very close. But He said, you've got to obey. And He says, now here's the consequences if you don't. And they didn't learn. And so they struggled, didn't they? These are shadows, again, even what I just said, of something that God is pointing to further down. So now we come to Jesus. When Jesus comes, at this point that we're going to pick up in His ministry, we see where He has already declared the fact, and we went through those lessons preaching Jesus, that He was proclaiming He was the Son of Man. And that just made their brains explode because they knew what the law and the prophets said when somebody said they were the Son of Man. They were saying they were God. Jesus very clearly said, I'm the Son of Man. In ways He would say it, it was inevitable that that's exactly what He meant. He picked up Isaiah. Remember when He went home and He opened the scroll and He read? And he basically said there, and he shut it down, and he said it, and he sat down, and he goes, and today it's fulfilled. And a part of that message was what? I am he. I am the Son of Man. So they were already upset, considering him a blasphemer. But then we find, and this is interesting, because in the Gospels, we find where that this Sabbath conflict is more than what we give it credit for. We see this going on, and it's beautiful. Because now think, he is the Son of Man. He's God in the flesh. So now he's journeying along. It's on a Sabbath. The stage is set for a conflict. So we pick it up in Mark 2:23. On the Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you not read what David did? And he was in the need, and he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered into the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And also he gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, here it is, of even the Sabbath." Now go back, you jump to the Gospel of John. John, chapter 1, verse 1, starts out very clearly saying, this Jesus was God, and he's the one that built everything. Every day when God said, let there be light, let there do this, guess who did it? The Son of Man, Jesus did. Guess who is the Lord of the Sabbath? You know, when they asked Jesus who he was, he said, I am. You know what they did? He just took them back to Moses whenever he was meeting Moses in the burning bush, and that was Jesus. That's a shadow. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I am God in the flesh. This is my day. This is for man. Get the thing? See, I would get lost in that. You know, the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Does that kind of confuse you when you kind of read it like that? It's kind of like, so slow down. It's my day. But what's the purpose, right? That's the point. In other words, it's not a day in which I have legislated that you must follow as a regulatory type of day. It's a day for you. It's a day for you to rest and think about the relationship we should have and go back to why you're resting, because just like all the creation, and go all the way back like I just did, that's what it was for. But they had literally ripped out any possible rest. They had taken it completely out. And by the way, you know, there was a Sabbath day's walk. Yeah, you can only walk like 2,000 yards. Now I won't go on that. You ought to look it up. There's some really funny things that they did. There's one of them that they got in a big argument on whether a woman could take the water from the dishwater and throw it out, because that's work. Oh, another thing. A woman could not look in a mirror because she might see a gray hair and want to pluck it. That's work. So now what are they saying? They violated all kinds of things about the Sabbath. First off, the thing about the fields and the availability, they're not like here. Like you go off the road here and go pick pecans, it's illegal. You know, when I was a kid, we used to go steal watermelons out of a farmer field. Don't smile. I know you probably, we do that stuff, and it's like no big deal, right? Did you know God in his mercy actually said, I want it to be so that when people are traveling along and they're hungry, just on the edge. Now, they couldn't walk in the middle of the field and start harvesting. Hey, there's a bigger watermelon in the middle over there. Let's go get those watermelons. No. It was to sustain. It was to take care of you so you wouldn't go hungry. But so the roads were purposefully, not kind of like what we have in the farming area here, where they're right next to the fields. So as people would journey from town to town, they walked everywhere. You're not going to walk fast enough to an Arby's, right? I mean, where are you going to get your food? And when you got where you're going, where are you going to get it? What are you going to eat? So God made that provision. As you're walking along, if you were hungry, you could take some if there was harvest, and you could eat it. So what are they doing? They're harvesting. And violation 1. Then you know what they did? They sieved it when they rubbed it. They willowed it when they threw it out. When they bit it, they were grinding it. There were like 4 or 5 different Sabbaths that they broke, rules, according to them. But you know what the funniest is? The fact that they missed that they were also Sabbath breakers. Where's the field at? Why are you walking behind them? Why are you following them? Who's dogging them? The very people who are so, mind-blowingly narrow about the Sabbath are actually breaking the Sabbath so they could catch them breaking the Sabbath because they're walking too far. You could only walk like 2,000 feet or something. So it's just one of those things. It's like, look, they're so focused. But they had just, the essence of what we're looking at is a conflict of saying, you know what? You have taken out the beauty of this purpose for man. Now, you notice he uses that very kind of difficult passage when he goes, hey, have you not read when David, when he was on the run from Saul was trying to kill him, that he was destitute and he was fleeing for his life and his men, and he went into the temple, the tabernacle. And he said, do you have any food? And the priest goes, no, the only food I have is the showbread that's over here on the table in the tabernacle. Now, the law was set up to where there was 12 loaves, and each of those 12 loaves represented 12 tribes. At the end of the week, on day 6, guess what they did? They took those 12, they took them off, and they brought in freshly baked ones. Now, you think, well, let's eat the old stuff, right? Nah, even then, they weren't to eat those. Only the priest. But it doesn't bother the high priest. He even says, he goes, you know what? I don't even have the old stuff. He goes, all I have is this. The priest, because he saw the situation and condition that they were in. It wasn't like, Arby's just closed. I'm not going to make it to Wendy's. Could I get some bread here? These men were on the run. And that's what he's missing. What is more important? Keeping the showbread. You think God really needs that bread? Do you think it's so important that if you take it off, God's going to strike you with lightning when you're showing compassion to somebody who is desperately in need of something? But I know a little bit of that legalistic in you sitting there going, well, wait a minute, Ron. It is. Remember that fire and the 2 brothers? Yeah, let's remember those 2 brothers. They had the wrong heart and they were drunk. But see how narrow you can get? And you start seeing that? He goes, don't you remember that? That still didn't buy it for them. They didn't care. So we jump to chapter 3 in Mark 3. And again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save or to kill? Oh, wait, that's not food. That's not work. That's a moral issue. That didn't quite. That's why it says next, they were silent. So can you forget about those things? Can you? See, that's the whole point. Do you just escape the fact that now, you don't keep yourself morally decent? And that, no, sorry, man, I can't do that. And that's where, and then so in verse 5, and he looked around with anger, grieved at the hardness of their heart. And he said to them, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisee went out, and they immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him on how to destroy him. Were they listening? No, they weren't. Luke's account, another one of a conflict on the Sabbath, really helps to bring this home. He says, and he said to them, which of you, having a son or an ox, has fallen into a well on Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out? And they couldn't answer him, because they knew what the answer was. Yes, you're going to go and you're going to rescue that person. Yes, David, in a destitute situation he was in, could eat that, even though it was on the Sabbath. You know what you've done is you have taken the grace of God and you've ripped it out of this. And you've made it more torturous than restful, right? Now remember something he said. Now when he said that I am the Lord of the Sabbath, he said, now that's Mosaic, that's old law. We'll say, well, yeah. Shadow, okay? Shadow. Where did our shadow start? You remember at the beginning of the lesson? Where did the shadow start? It started with the first day of the week, the first day of that week when God rested. Shadow started. Then it continued when we see it given to the Mosaic law. We see it abused whenever the Pharisees. But Jesus had been the Lord of the Sabbath from the creation of the first day of rest. It was Him. It's always been His day. But He says, I brought it to you. It's for you. So He is the Lord of the Sabbath. So when the old law was done away with, did He quit being the Sabbath? Trick question, huh? Yes and no. Yes, the shadow went away. No, the real thing came. Because guess what? He is the Sabbath, rest. Jesus is where we get rest. And that's the only place that we can get it. Is it a day of the week? No. That's what He was trying to get across to them, is that He is the Lord and it was made for man. That means it doesn't apply to your religious superstitions and things like that. It's going to be a shadow, just like the kingdom was a shadow. That there was going to be this kingdom come. Just like He told Pilate when he stood before him, He said, are you a king? He goes, it's rightly so. But my kingdom, He said, what? Is not of this earth. The kingdom of the physical law, the physical kingdom was a shadow of the beautiful spiritual kingdom that the prophet Daniel prophesied about that came. The Sabbath is the same way. It's the shadow of the true, beautiful thing that was intended from the beginning. And that was Jesus. And the only place. That's why the Hebrew writer, in trying to bring people to that understanding about the greatness of Jesus over the Mosaic law, he brings them to this point and he says, look, Moses failed to bring them into Sabbath. You know those rascals, right? What did they do? They just argued. When they went to go into the land of promise, they sent 12 spies in. 10 of them come out and go, we can't do this. And so God, in His anger, they wandered for 40 years. All of them died. They failed to enter in to the Sabbath. Moses never let them in. Remember that? Moses didn't lead them in. So that's what He's bringing them up. That's what I'm bringing up to you. The Mosaic law, Moses himself could not bring them that rest. That's the shadow of the land of milk and honey, was of what? The kingdom of Jesus Himself. That's the real thing. The land of milk and honey wasn't the real thing. But the Hebrew writer's trying to bring that out, that there was something else. And then in 4, 8, and 9, the Hebrew writer says, for if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for what? The people of God. There's still one there, he's saying. And he goes on to show that we have it, that we have this rest, and that it is in the superiority of all aspects of Jesus Himself, that the only place is there. And that's why He said they never were able to, even Joshua, bless him, he took them across the river, they conquered, but they never really conquered at all, did they? They failed. And then when they did get the land, what did they do? They still failed. You see, every kingdom that man puts together in this world will fail. Every time we try to make ourselves righteous, we will fail in this physical world. We can't do it. And that's why God taught us that lesson. You can't get much closer to the real thing, and yet we couldn't achieve it under the Mosaic law. So where's it at? It's in Jesus. That's why I think this Matthew chapter 11 means so much more when we come to think about Him while He was teaching that I am the Lord of rest. Look what He says in 11:28. Come to me, all who labor and are laden. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest, Sabbath, for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Isn't that an invite that we miss? We read it and we realize it. Wow, that's wonderful. We use this all the time. But you realize that's the Lord of the Sabbath inviting you? The Lord of the Sabbath that created everything? That's the real thing standing before them and us this morning, saying, Come to me, you who are heavy burdened and laden and hard worked and tortured. Come, for I will give you Sabbath. Nowhere else. Back in Hebrews, though, this is a condition, though, that he's also giving them a little bit of a warning. In Hebrews 4:1-3, he says, Therefore, while the promise of entering the rest still stands, let us fear, lest any of you should have seemed to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as them. What was that? The Mosaic law was preached to them. They failed to enter it. The gospel is preached to you. Guess what? You can fail, is what he's saying. For the good news came to us just as them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united in faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest. Now this is the thing that's fascinating to me, because he's talking about this rest, but then he also shifts over and talks about something else that's unique, and that is a relationship base. When we look at one another, where is the Sabbath rest? Is it here in this building among this local group of Christians? Is the Sabbath rest here? No, it's in Him. And that's what John says in 1 John chapter 1 when he talks about our relationship. The only reason we're sitting here this morning is because I have a relationship with Him, you have a relationship with Him, she has a relationship with Him. That's it. It's there first. That is my Sabbath. Now, if I've got a Sabbath rest with Him, guess what I want to share with you? Some Sabbath rest with the brethren. We should be as close as we can. You know, that's what Paul tried to bring to them, was a rest among the brethren and to put aside these things. And so, no doubt, that's why the Hebrew writer turns around and he comes back and he says, strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness with which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. You know, one little seed of unrest is like that little seed of yeast that can spread, that leaven, and create all unrest. That's what he's kind of talking about. We should be as close as we could get to the real Sabbath rest that we're all going to eventually. We've achieved it individually with Him, but there's a shadow as well as something, the final Sabbath that we will finally achieve. But be careful. What could happen? Bitterness and things like that. Romans 12:16, the Apostle Paul says there, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. How many times are you smarter than the brother sitting next to you? Or the sister, you know. The old joke is, you know, somebody will come up and tell me, yeah, I'm sure glad that, you know, you preached that sermon because my brother I'm glad he was here today. He could hear that sermon that you're preaching because he needed it. Kind of a joke, right? A little funny. But haven't you thought that? I know people have. I do. Because I'm sorry I've done it. Sometimes I get up here and I go, oh boy, I'm glad so-and-so's here because I got this lesson. It fits them. What am I doing? I'm judging, aren't I? And that takes away the rest. That takes away the rest. This is what he's saying in Romans 14, verse 13, when he says, therefore let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. James 4:11, look what he says. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. One who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but you're a judge. And by the way, who can honestly be a good judge? There's only one. Be careful, in other words. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have standards. It doesn't mean that we just let people want. If I love you, I will tell you there's something wrong. But what does Paul exhort in Galatians? He says, let those who are spiritual handle those stuff, right? Don't just let anybody. There are some people you just don't want them to go tell certain personal news because they'll destroy it. And then you got that one guy that could tell somebody bad news and they would walk away smiling. They got that ability to help to teach. And so it does. But it does. So what I'm saying is, yes, don't judge. But the point is, we're too quick to judge. Well, where were you last Sunday? Well, you haven't been here in a while. Huh? What are you doing? Yeah, I'm picking on him. Then he feels guilty and he feels bad. I just judged him. Who am I to judge him? See? And what does that do when I do it? I take the Sabbath away. I take away the peace that we should have. The power is in the peace, in that rest. This is why I love Psalm 133. Listen to this. Behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It is like precious oil on the head, running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls in the morning of Zion, for there the Lord knows how beautiful we should have it. And that should set us apart, make us different, make us holy. When people can see that there's a place that they can come that is restful, peaceful among the brethren, they're attracted to it. And it also makes us more powerful in our ability to do the Lord's work. So we can be just as destructive and destroy the local Sabbath, and we have to be careful about that. I know I probably have done that to some by judging or saying something dumb, but then also I've learned to mature that when you say things and I don't get upset. It's okay. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to put a stumbling block. I'm going to do everything I can to lift you up above me. You notice he said, don't think your opinions are wiser than somebody else's. You may have the truth, but is it worth causing someone to stumble? Be considerate, be loving, be building up of one another. So my invite, if you haven't come, is to come. Come, enjoy that rest. If we're struggling with rest, why? It's very interesting how these sleep labs have popped up all over the nation, man. They're making millions and millions of dollars. You go to the doctor and I say, yeah, I'm having trouble sleeping. You know how many times I've been referred to a sleep lab? Oh, you need to go to a sleep lab. You probably have sleep apnea. And blah, blah, blah. And I actually went one time and they gave me that thing. And I gave me medicine and I paid, my insurance probably paid thousands of dollars, They got an EEG thing they put on your head and then you come back with a machine. And if you don't sleep enough, they tell you they could break it all down because I'm going to tell you there's one place, and I'm not talking physical, but spiritual, that will solve it a lot. And that's in Christ. We're chasing after rest, aren't we? And a lot of times we're chasing after the wrong diet program, spiritual program, when the simplicity is in Jesus Christ. That's where it's at. It starts there. Now, I'm not knocking the sleep labs, by the way. I'm not endorsing them, not knocking them, but I think there's something there. We're chasing after that sleep lab of Christ, aren't we? We're that sleep lab of spirituality, and we're failing. And people are selling us stuff and giving us all sorts of programs to help us sleep spiritually in a better rest, and yet it's not working. It's not working. It's just simple. Believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that He is the one who has sacrificed it all, and He has paid for that reconciliation and rest through His blood. And He just says you have to believe that I am who I am. And then with that, we see the teachings of the book of Acts, where it says very clearly, you want this rest? You want this? Turn your life, decide, make a decision to stop living the way you were, and be baptized in order to receive the forgiveness of sins. That brings us into Christ. Like Paul said, do you not know, as many of us were baptized into Christ? So this is something that I want us to think about while we sing this song. And if there's something we can do to help you or any time, either continue that rest, build that rest up, establish that rest. That's what our urgency is for you this morning while we stand and sing.
Why keep Jesus waiting, waiting in the cold? He will bear you gently, gently to his fold. See him soul and open, open I implore. Why keep Jesus waiting, waiting at the door? Oft he knocketh softly, softly o'er and o'er. Hear him soul and open, open I implore. Why keep Jesus pleading, pleading at the door? He would be your Savior ever, evermore. Love him soul and open, open I implore. Why keep Jesus waiting, knocking at the door? Soon he'll cease his pleading, yes, forevermore. Come, poor soul, obey him.